Hey everyone, Joseph Shapiro here, co-founder of Psychedelic League with Sarah Price. Really happy to have some guests on today, which are in businesses or prospective psychedelic businesses, and we're going to ask them some questions. They're going to share with us what they do, and uh, and yeah, so let's just get straight to it. Sarah, would you mind making intros?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have got Ayesha Dolasa and Farmer Steve or Steve Robinson. A little bit about Ayesha. Thank you both for being here. We're really excited. So Ayesha has a master's of science in environmental. Let me see if I can read straight today. Ayesha has a master of science in environmental engineering from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst.
Amherst.
Amherst, I knew this. After experimenting for 2 years, the husband and wife team, Ayesha and Jacob Tulius, found Noble Mushrooms LLC in 2017. In 2023, Ayesha left her full-time job to focus on the business. Noble Mushrooms grows several varieties of mushrooms that are sold at farmers markets, direct to customers from the farm, and to wholesale accounts. Noble Mushrooms also provides mycological lab services to other farms in New Jersey. The work includes the isolation of mushroom mycelium from contaminants, starting from tissue and spores, the expansion of the mycelium into spawn, and finally the inoculation of bulk substrate, which is then sold to farmers so they can grow their own mushrooms to provide to their customer base, which we're going to learn all about that more today. So recently they launched an online store to offer educational classes, growing kits, spawn, and other cultivation material to the general public. Steve is the owner of Urban Farmer Steve LLC, a family-owned urban farm located in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. His company specializes in growing hyper-local, consistently fresh gourmet mushrooms, microgreens, herbs, and edible flowers for the New Jersey and Philadelphia area. Steve is a former Army officer and combat veteran that served in the Army from 2001 to 2010. He's a Rutgers University alumni and has served in various roles for the federal government after completing his military service. Steve has also completed the Veterans to Farmers program in Denver, Colorado, which helps veterans assimilate effectively, productively, and permanently into private citizenry by training them in various types of agricultural practices and typically leads to careers in farming or business ownership. So, really, really excited to hear, from both of you guys, like, what is it that drove you for an interest in your business, which is, cultivating, growing plants? And then also, what is it that drives you to your interest in the psychedelic space as well? So, Ayesha, if you want to start.
Sure. So first, Sarah, I'm going to do a little science. Fungi are not plants, and they are actually two separate kingdoms. And the fungi kingdom is sort of almost a little new to us. Even educationally, it was kind of a little unknown to me. I thought it was a plant for the longest time. And when we discovered it in 2015, it was as part of a research we were doing. We really liked gardening, and we wanted to get into the agricultural space. We're kind of semi back to the land kind of people. We're both engineers, me and my husband, and so we started researching, and we looked at a lot of options. And then we stumbled upon mushrooms, and it sort of just took on a life of its own. And really part of it is that mystery about it, that curiosity for us, because as scientists who are, we thought, quite educated, we had no idea what fungus was. And from there we've just sort of developed a real sort of passion and love for. We continue to love the farming community and the agricultural space, but our particular niche with mushrooms continues to fascinate us. There's so much to learn, so much to explore. I think even as a sort of the human race as a whole, we're just barely touching the surface. We have millions of mushrooms that are undiscovered as yet. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's super. Thank you for that clarification too, because I was always like, "Oh, they're all plants." They're not all plants. So thank you for that. Steve, we'd love to hear a little bit about what brought you to the. I mean, you kind of, we illuminated to a little bit in the bio, but your personal passion for fungi.
Yes. So like Ayesha, farming, I would say, really is my passion. I've been more drawn to mushrooms over the past year. And Ayesha and her husband Jake have been a great mentor to me as I've been developing my business through mushrooms. I would say I was drawn to farming post-military, post-government. I've worked very stressful jobs throughout my life, and there's nothing like being farming, being grounded, being close to the land. Um, I would say I was drawn to the farming space through cannabis. I was interested actually in getting into the cannabis space. I've learned how to grow it, cultivate it. I went through a lot of the business courses when New Jersey was getting interested in legalizing it for recreation. But for whatever reason, I decided just to get into a more focus on farming as a whole. And the reason why is because there's just a lack of farming, especially in the Black community. Let's be frank about it. And in the inner cities, folks really are not in tune with green spaces, and we need more green spaces in our community. So when I went through the Veterans to Farmers program out in Denver, Colorado, I was introduced to the controlled environment agriculture, CEA, which is basically farming indoors, hydroponic farming. So through going through that program, I went through it a couple summers ago. I really started to develop a passion for farming indoors, teaching others how to farm. So I've worked with some groups in Burlington and Camden and Philly, just trying to spark the interest of farming. In a lot of our communities, farming is looked at as a negative thing. So I'm trying to bring a more positive outlook to farming, and to kind of turn it back to mushrooms. So being a combat veteran, I've seen how the effects of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and all those things that negatively affected veterans going back to post 9/11 and prior to that. And I see what psychedelics. I'm just been doing a lot of research on psychedelics and seeing how the amazing effects that they're doing with veterans that have some of those issues. So I'm really trying to become more versed and learn more and advocate for my veteran brothers and sisters that I think need more access to to that space. So I think I kind of went off, but yeah, so that's me.
Great.
That's perfect. Perfect. Well, I guess it's like, let's kind of dive a little bit into like, when we talk about the fact that there's this difference, right, between fungi and plants and the growing process for fungi, can you guys share a little bit with us about like, what does it mean to grow fungi and mushrooms, and why is it so specifically different than other plants, like, like the microgreens, for example, that Steve works with?
Okay, I'll start, and then I'll give it over to Steve. So I think the best place to start is to understand the fungi life cycle and and then that kind of shows you how different it is from a plant. So I think most people are familiar with the plants. It's the seed going into a plant, and you either eat the plant or you eat the flower or a fruit from that. For a mushroom, it's so we'll start with the mushroom. The mushroom is what we call the fruiting body of the fungi, and it's basically the reproductive, kind of like a fruit or a flower. It disperses spores into the environment that are then germinating, basically, to produce. And it's not a seed necessarily. It's a little bit different. It's sort of, you need two spores from the same sort of species of mushrooms to germinate, and they find each other, and then they become a sort of they have to sort of be happy with each other, I guess, in some ways, and then they sort of merge, and then they start forming mycelium, which is kind of the sort of the rooty kind of fibrous stuff that's not usually seen. It's under the ground or it's inside logs. but it's typically white, but not always white, kind of this sort of thready, cottony material. And so this mycelium is really the body of the fungi. That's like the main thing. And it goes through a process of, multiplying, and it can go really like miles out in some cases, to look for food, and in all different directions. So it really kind of is this idea of it spreads like a net into the environment, and it's both helping the environment, and in some cases protecting itself against the environment by putting out certain enzymes that would sort of keep away bacteria. So it's a good antibacterial because it knows how to protect itself, and that's where we actually get penicillin from, is from a fungus, or actually a mold, but okay, we won't get too crazy today. So as it's growing, when it gets signals from the environment that the humidity is right, the temperatures are right, it's got the right conditions, and then it decides, oh, okay, it's a good time for me to put out more mushrooms, and then it'll to reproduce, and then it'll bloom, and it'll put out the fruiting bodies, and therefore continuing that cycle. So when you go into the forest and you pick a mushroom, you're not really hurting the fungus. That organism continues to survive. You are just basically like pulling a flower or eating an apple off a tree. It is not harming the full organism as such.
That's really cool. I know I've always heard this idea that the mycelium is like the nervous system of like the earth, and like that all plants even utilize that part of the plant in nature, that part of the fungi.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that, is kind of new and very interesting, that they, the relationships they're finding between the plants and the fungi in nature. It seems to be a lot of it is mutualistic, helpful to both sides, even though, from a farming side, I think maybe people are more familiar with the parasitic nature of fungus and always trying to control the fungus. And with fungicides, but I think we're learning more that it's really a big range of relationships that fungus and plants have, and that depending on the environment, it could change. It would go from a happy mutualistic to a parasitic. The one interesting thing with fungus is it's the only organism really that can break down the hard material, the lignin that's a tree. So if you didn't have fungus in the environment, you would just have trees just piling up in front. There's no bacteria, there's no termites break down wood by using fungus. So fungus is really the way that the digestion of those really complex polymers in nature can be broken down. And that's why it's just got this really untapped potential in terms of what it can do. Its digestion is external. It puts out enzymes into the environment and then pulls back what it needs.
So when it comes to farming mushrooms, how do you approach that versus plants, even hydroponically? What are the distinctions between those two?
So I think the biggest consideration, and one of the reasons that I was drawn to fungus and to mushrooms, is because to grow the best mushrooms and to grow the best plants or vegetables indoors, you need to control your environment. And to do that, you want to mimic the best environment for certain mushrooms to grow in. Each mushroom variety that we grow, they may grow. There's a general temperature that we try to keep our fruiting rooms in, and those are the rooms that once the mushrooms are fully pollinated, they're ready to fruit bodies. There's an ideal temperature and an ideal humidity that you want your mushrooms to thrive in, or your plants to thrive in if you're growing indoors. And I think the similarities is kind of what drew me to mushrooms also, because each variety of mushrooms, some grow better in higher temperatures, some grow better in lower temperatures, same with humidity. But we try to keep them at a constant, at a general temperature where they all can grow reasonably well. So I think that, the key to growing excellent mushrooms and consistent mushrooms is to try to control your environment. And so essentially it is controlled environment agriculture, where you try to mimic the environment that that plant or that fungi or that mushroom grows well in. And the better you can mimic those environmental controls, the better product you will have.
Now, whenever you say like the specific environment, is there a different environment? Because I have heard like rainy season is when they really start fruiting. Is that is growing the mycelium versus growing the fruiting body? Does that sometimes require different, like slightly different environments, or can they all happen within the same environment?
Yeah, so it is different, and I guess that's the part that we kind of specialize in. Is kind of, we're a little bit more focused on the mycelium side, in terms of, we do the lab work, because there's like millions of spores in the air that we're breathing, so we have to maintain sterile conditions to make sure that we get the mushroom that we want. So versus nature, where everything is like spores, and that's kind of like the more sort of I'd say the more sort of sexual reproduction. We actually tend to clone in a commercial setting. So we'll do cloning onto agar plates in a clean, sterile environment. So this is the sort of our circle of life in the lab. Is it goes onto a plate. We grow it out similar to how you grow out bacteria on a plate, or any other vegetable or animal culture. And then from there, it's a series of steps to expand that mycelium. So we typically go into a liquid culture, which is like some kind of sugary material, again, all under sterile conditions. So we'll put the mycelium in there, let it multiply in there. Then we'll take it from the liquid culture into a grain, into sterilized grain. And that's what we call spawn. So we'll kind of go from grain to grain, from a small amount to a larger amount. And then finally, the bulk substrate is a wood substrate. It's sawdust based for most of the ones we do. There's two classes of mushrooms, the compost loving and then the wood loving. Right now, we're mainly focused on the wood loving varieties for gourmet mushrooms. So then we put it into, it's not necessarily sterilized, but we do a pasteurization for the sawdust, because it's a cleaner, it doesn't have as much competition at that point. And we put a little bit of the grain spawn into those to create what we call, and I'll show you what it kind of looks like, we call them blocks, these mushroom blocks. And that's basically our main product, is these 5-pound blocks that we sell to farmers like Steve and others in New Jersey mostly. And this is fully colonized, so you see all this white. It typically starts the color of wood, like a brown, it's a sawdust. And so over time it gets white. And when we do that stage, we don't need to we control temperature. We try to keep it, at a comfortable, like around plus or minus 70 degrees. But it doesn't need to have humidity or any other special lighting or anything like that. It does have a filter. This is a little watery because it's grown. It does have a filter patch on it so it can breathe. So that's another difference between fungus and plants, is that fungus are closer to animals in that way, where they breathe oxygen and give out carbon dioxide. So you need to let them have that access to good ventilation to breathe. But at this stage, I mean, there's really, it's a very controlled, we do this in an office building, in a basement in an office building, where there's professionals around, and there's no concerns in terms of any contamination or anything that might sort of adversely affect the other people here. We're not high humidity; it's a very low humidity, so we're not producing, I know there was a concern with black mold. We're not, that's not from anything where in our production that's putting that out there. So once Steve gets this, I'll let him go. That's when a little more. So what we say is, our part is very much the science part, And then once I take it into the fruiting room or Steve takes it into the fruiting room, it gets a little bit arty there. It's a little bit more intuitive.
For sure. And like, did you have a question, Joe? It looked like you were getting ready to say. Okay.
I was gonna ask a question, and then Ayesha perfectly handed the baton to you. So no.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like Ayesha said, the more scientific part is done on their end. As a farmer, I actually met Ayesha at a farming conference, and we kind of fostered a relationship with their farm. But and added mushrooms as another product to offer some of our customers. So once I received that fully colonized block from Ayesha, I wish I had a prop. If I'd known Ayesha was bringing one, I would have brought one too. I take it to my growing space, which I have a controlled temperature. Typically, my temperatures are between 65 to 70 degrees. We aim for a higher humidity, around 85 to 90 degree humidity. And we try to maintain those temperatures throughout the year. Now, the summertime, it typically gets a little warmer in our grow rooms, and that affects the growth of certain types of mushrooms. So, for instance, we have a pink oyster variety of mushroom that grows really well during the summertime because the temperatures seem to get a little higher in our fruiting rooms during the summertime. And then when you switched over to cooler temperatures in the winter, we have the blue oyster mushroom that grows really well, and the pink doesn't do so well. So there's different, like I said, there's different mushrooms that grow better in different temperatures. And then we just have to adjust by season. So, I let all my chefs know in advance, hey, summertime, we're going to have these pinks going pretty hard. And then once the weather starts to change, I'm going to transition to the blue oysters just as a result of that change. So, and that's pretty much it. So once we get them, we fruit them. Typically, from the time they're colonized to harvest is typically anywhere from 10 to 14 days. Then we harvest those, and they go to, the farmers markets, restaurants, or, grocery stores.
I have to say, I saw Ayesha on I think I can't remember whose website it was that I saw it on. Those pink oyster mushrooms are beautiful. They look like almost like roses. Yeah. They look like actual kind of more flowers. I'm curious for each of you guys, what are the space requirements for like each of your parts within this?
So the mycelium, because we've got a nice network of local New Jersey farmers who buy from us, we've sort of developed that business a little bit bigger than our fruiting business. So we probably have around, I'd say, about 2,000 square feet where we do the mycelium, growing the blocks. And a big part of the space is just them sitting on shelves waiting to colonize. And the reason that we like doing that in our space versus giving it to Steve to do it in his space is that there are things that can go wrong in that time. So if there is any contamination, any mold contamination, it's going to show up during that phase. And so we will pull those blocks out and make sure that they don't get into the farmer's hands. And so it's, it's just a lot of just sitting around blocks. And then we have a couple of clean rooms and, workspaces within that space. On the fruiting side, I only fruit about, I think, I'm going to say 30 by 8. So about 240 square feet of space that I use for fruiting. About, I'd say, between 100, 150 pounds a week is kind of my maximum that I can fruit on my own. So it is very sort of space efficient to grow mushrooms in general. I actually think when we start talking about the psychedelic mushrooms, I think the efficiency is even more so with psychedelics.
Yes. And I think something key to note is that, and Ayesha brought this up, is the vertical aspect of fruiting. If you look at those racks directly behind Ayesha, typically those are what those mushroom blocks would be placed on, something similar to that. And just like cannabis, you can go as high as you possibly could go inside it. So you could have 250 square feet of space, but 100, 200, 300 for ceilings, and you could grow as high as you possibly could. So that's something else to keep in mind when we're talking about the size of spaces. With growing mushrooms, you can grow a lot of mushrooms in a small space.
Yeah, well, so when it comes to, now that we're on the topic of psilocybin, you guys, I know you're both well aware of the pending legislation in Trenton, because that's where I think we first met you, was when you were testifying in Trenton. And you made some great points during the testimony, which I'd love you to kind of like recreate some of those points you made during your testimony. But when it comes to psilocybin product manufacturing, which is how that is phrased in the bill, what would you envision the need, like continuing with the discussion about space, and there was a distinction between Ayesha's space and Steve's space. What kind of space would you envision needing for psilocybin? And would you break up the roles like you currently are breaking them up? How would you envision the workflow?
Yeah, you could probably, because of actually, honestly, because of the framework of the legalized framework, it's probably just as easier for the growers, which I would like, and that was one of my comments with that at Trenton, is I really think calling us manufacturers is doing a disservice to us as well as to this lovely organism. Farming's a better word. I'll take grower, I guess, if we can compromise. But I think it'll probably easier to have everything more or less under one umbrella. So you're not, otherwise each person is going to have a separate license to do the lab work, and then so any materials will have to be licensed. It's not even the mycelium of the psilocybin mushroom containing mushrooms are legal federally. It's only, I believe, only spores for lab purposes and research purposes are legal under the federal law. So to me, it makes sense, if you're paying for a license, kind of try and keep everything under one umbrella, unless the license fee is really reasonable.
Got it. And then, so let's say you did set up, or like you did decide to set up a new space or convert your existing space. What would that workflow look like specifically for Psilocybin cubensis, which will likely be what would be allowed to be grown if we're going on what Oregon did? What would you envision that workflow looking like, and how much do you think you can grow, and how much do you think New Jersey would need?
So I'm going to start at the end there, because it really depends on what that need is going to be, right? I mean, I don't really have an idea, even with Oregon, what their numbers are in terms of how many patients they're treating. But just from the cost of it, right? They're telling me it's somewhere in the 3,000 range. I'm guessing they're not it's not millions. It's probably maybe thousands, maybe tens of thousands in a year of patients getting the treatment. So I would say that the numbers look small. I think, sorry, I lost my train of thought. In terms of the workflow, it's a very similar workflow to what we have right now in terms of doing some initial plate work, going into the grain spawn. The one difference is the psilocybin-containing mushrooms, cubensis particularly, is a manure-loving mushroom versus a wood-loving mushroom. And then the theory is that it probably has transferred around the world through herbivores. So everyone's kind of a little familiar with the cow patties, sprouting these mushrooms. But in a sort of our typical human way, you can still grow it on manure, but we've also found sort of not really synthetic, but a cleaner, let's say, way of growing it. And you can use a coconut coir substrate mix to do that. And it's just handling wise, it's just a little easier. Manure's not necessarily the sort of nicest or easiest thing to grow on. Although I will say, Pennsylvania, God bless them, Kennett Square is the capital of the button mushroom, and they use manure and compost for all your button mushrooms, all your cremini mushrooms, all your portobello mushrooms, none of which I grow right now because they just dominate the market and I cannot compete with those kind of numbers there.
Yeah, I've heard some interesting information. I've heard some interesting stories about that market, that particularly. It's an interesting backstory.
Yes, and there's certainly an odor associated with Kennett Square,
There you
with manure based. So
That's
you
fun,
to try
yeah.
and so I think for townships, I feel that it's good for them to know that we won't necessarily have to be in a manure setting. We can grow in a coconut coir based substrate, which does not have those odor issues. We would grow honestly in a more controlled fashion than I grow my blue oysters. So we recently started growing cordyceps here, and this is my cordyceps room. So I'm inside in an office building in the cordyceps room, and we're growing in a Tupperware, and that's very similar to how the cubensis is grown or would be suggested to be grown. I'm sure there's more than one way. But from our research, it can be a very contained. I never have to worry about humidity the way I have to worry about humidity with my blue oysters. The temperature is easier to control when you don't have to worry about as much air exchange and humidity. So it's highly controlled, stackable. It's actually, it's been around for a while now in the US since the 50s or 60s. I don't know which generation you guys were from, but college kids figured out how to do it. It's not a rocket science. It's not they know if a kid can figure it out in his freshman, I'm sure it's not that complicated a process.
Yeah, so Steve, it sounds like, you can compare and contrast cannabis and psilocybin. Which one do you think is easier? Yeah.
So psilocybin, to be completely honest, is easier for sure, and the turnaround time is so much quicker. The life cycle. So that's the other thing to keep in mind too with psilocybin is not only can you go vertical, smaller growing spaces, but the life cycle is really fast.
And what we're actively doing now is talking with mayors and council members about the bill, because we're saying there might be legalization in New Jersey. We're not sure. We don't know how it's all going to play out. And I know you're both part of the coalition, so you know this already. I'm kind of saying it for everyone, but we're talking with these mayors about what to expect, and they're all comparing it initially to cannabis. So if you were going to make an argument about why psilocybin is not cannabis when it comes to cultivation or growing, what are the top things that you could argue or say that you think would convince them that it's something that they shouldn't worry about being in their town?
Well, the biggest one for me is the odor issues. I know a lot of the grow facilities have to put scrubbers to control odors, and there's no odors out of the mushrooms growing process. I think this is another thing I hear a lot about is it's not usually a smoked product either. So even in terms of usage, it's an ingested product, just like our mushrooms, right? We eat them. So the whole air quality issue is, I think it's good for them to know that it's not even going to be obvious. I'm almost positive that half the people in my office building don't know that they have a mushroom farmer on premises. We're just very, we're not in your face kind of.
And what about production? I'm sorry, go ahead, Steve. I was gonna ask.
I was gonna piggyback off Ayesha. The odor to me would be the most blatant thing for sure. There's no odor that's going to transfer on your body. moving from space to space. There's still a very sterile factor to growing mushrooms, which is similar to cannabis. I think that may be probably the biggest thing. Is sterilization is key when growing mushrooms. But the odor to me would be the most blatant thing for sure, and that's something you would not deal with mushrooms.
So unlike cannabis, you don't need special ventilation or cooling systems. Like you don't need to install, or what? To what extent would you need to retrofit something?
So there's definitely what is important is air exchange, and that's just because you need fresh air circulating through, but that's going to be contained within your environment typically. But I'm sorry, what was your question again, Joseph?
Yeah, well, with some cannabis, like if you were cultivating cannabis, you would likely, like Ayesha said, need scrubbers put into the HVAC system, or maybe you probably even need extra like air ducts or
right, yeah, carbon filters just to kind of keep the air. Yep, I got you.
Right.
Yeah.
Like if you were setting up in some town and you had a space that you could rent or own to run a cultivation facility, how much work on the building do you think you would need to do, like on the exterior of the building, or to its major components, if any, to set up a psilocybin grow?
Honestly, assuming all the utilities are in place, cooling, heating, so they want. I kind of treat them like pets. They want to be the same temperature we are. They want to have the same air that has enough oxygen to breathe as we do. But other than that, I would not need to retrofit, other than what the law will require in terms of security.
I think that'll be another interesting one, because I mean, looking at it, sounds like you can have, because of the volume that may be used, and I actually pulled up just kind of some estimate numbers, and I think in the first year they said 3,500 people experienced journeys in a service center. And let's say you even just averaged out on a 3.5 gram, right? Some people are going to go less, some people are going to go more. And I think they tap out at 5 grams in Oregon. But so let's say we just average that. And I think it would be like 453 ounces in the first year, based on the numbers that I saw. And so I can imagine, like, if a growing space is really small, it's not like a large facility that needs a large amount of security. Like I'm not sure what the security requirements are, but I think they have to have guards all the time. But if you have a much smaller space to guard, that's going to be a little bit more economical, and it's not going to be as like, I think also too, like, in your face that there's illegal stuff happening here, or not illegal. There's like, this sort of stuff happening here. So it can be very much more, sort of blending in to the environment.
Discreet, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And that's a pretty low number in terms of mushrooms to grow. I would say, that would be in my 240 square feet. I'm sure, that would be sufficient. I think the part that, adds on a little bit, obviously the lab space adds on, and then, but also the drying, the processings would need some space for. So typically, you would consume the mushroom in a dried format or a powdered format, or I guess I'm not really familiar, but if they do gummies or something, that would be like the next process. But just in terms of just the natural product as is, typically just to preserve it, you would dry it, and we dry a lot of our mushrooms, just to prevent waste anyway.
Yeah, and that's dried volume. That's a dried 453 ounces of dried, which I think it's 3 ounces per pound, I think is what I might have seen. You can get from 1 pound of fresh 3 ounces of dried.
Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Yeah, we usually do a 1-to-10 ratio, because they are mostly water. They are largely like us. They are largely water.
It'd be great to see a cheat sheet that lets us understand these numbers, because I think it's hard to understand quantities in mushroom speak. Especially with psilocybin, where it's so potent. You're just like, wait, how much? like we're sitting here trying to figure it out. It'd be great to see it visually so we can share it with municipalities or legislators. Say like, this is like, it'd be great to see a visual. I'm very visual.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We should definitely, look at that, maybe in terms of, just decide on a size of like maybe a tote and say, okay, this would be how many, let's say 3 gram, uh, uh, you know, journeys for people. How much could one tote give you? I mean, I think my off the cuff calculations, but I think you're right. I think it's better as a visual. Let's not worry about it. I don't want to sprain an ankle here.
And then you can say, okay, here's the data and here's like a visualization of it. It's like, given this picture of how very little space we need, how do we make sure it's equitable? Because I think that was both of your testimonies. Like, how do we make sure that everybody can participate in this? Otherwise, why don't you just give it to some government contractor and they'll just grow the whole thing? And then you get into the nuance of like, perhaps there's like a craft to it. Perhaps there's different strains, and you get to the nuance, right, of it, and why perhaps it's good to have choice, different options and different. I think it's a good starting point for the conversation. It's like, you could say if you were meeting with a mayor, you can say, in your office, we could grow all the mushrooms that you need for the whole state within a 30-day turnover, right?
Right.
But it's not about quantity, it's about quality or something like that. So how do we start crafting the argument so that it's understood, okay, yeah, it's really about something else, not just getting the job done,
Yeah, I mean, I do think it is more than that. I mean, I think, in this limited sort of medical framework, it's going to be difficult to be very creative in terms of what you can do with this mushroom. But let me just put this out there. If you ever look on Reddit, you are going to see amateurs doing incredible, what you'd almost call like genetic work. So what you get with spores is it's kind of like breeding plants. You can interbreed and breed for a certain look. I've seen them like a baseball size, really funny shaped mushroom. I've seen really what they have like really high intensity concentrations of psilocybin, so the mushroom starts looking much darker blue. So this is on an amateur sort of scale. People play with it's not genetic modification, it's just hybridization, which is a natural process for mushrooms. Spore to spore, it's just selecting certain mushrooms. Obviously, with the medical sort of outlook that New Jersey is looking at, it's really going to come down to concentrations. You're going to be looking at, there is certain contaminants that they will probably look for just to make sure that there's not molds in the mushrooms. And then really, I think it's just, as far as I know for Oregon, it's just the one compound they look at is based on, with the concentration. So you'll take like what the quantity you have, and you'll take certain samples select number of samples from them, and then that will kind of define that batch of dry mushrooms for the final user to get the quantities they require. But I think in terms of quality, we decided last year to do organic certification. I will say, I think it's obviously that's not going to be possible with psychedelics because of the federal laws. But in terms of mushrooms in general, it's generally given to be a very organic process. There's not a pesticide or herbicide use in it. It's all really about keeping sterile conditions to begin with. And keeping that. But the reason to really distribute, to me, it's more really the spirit of the mushroom and the spirit of farming is to have that equity, is to allow different people, farming in general is not, it's not what you think about as a kid to be like, okay, let's go make our $1 million. We're going to go farm. that's not that's not how it is. And unfortunately, we're losing so many small farmers. And even New Jersey, I know several farms who, people who decided, they just couldn't make it work anymore. And that's always devastating to the whole community, because we're such a small community to begin with. And when we see our friends do it, we know we're at risk also, for going, for not being able to make it. So we're trying to make a living. And I think what, I honestly, what cannabis should have been able to do, and definitely what psychedelic mushrooms can do, is to help the farmers maintain themselves financially. And it is better to distribute it rather than to just have one mega grower. Because if they do have a problem, because as with any biological, there can be something that goes wrong. It'll wipe out your entire stock for a certain amount of time. Now with mushrooms, it won't be that long, but it's still, why not just distribute it? It's just a better way for our society to be. And in terms of what we're trying to do with this mushroom, it should, if we're talking mental health, I feel like you shouldn't be talking about mental health without talking about the community support around it.
I love that, and I'm glad you brought up spiritual, because we speak about that word once in a while here, because we recognize that there is something different when it comes to psychedelics, and I wonder where the proper place is. I think there is a place there to talk about. People are going to be taking these journeys, and there's the idea of set and setting, and
Yeah.
so like your mindset includes, to some degree, where do these mushrooms come from, and what was the intention behind the person. So you wonder, I think there's an intrinsic value to that, about who's growing these mushrooms, and like what were they intending, and then perhaps that can help the healing overall.
Absolutely. Yeah, Joe, just to piggyback off what you're saying, and that's why Ayesha and I and the other farmers in New Jersey are so passionate about this process and this bill, is because of the word manufacturers in there. And as farmers, we're trusted in the community. If Ayesha goes into her township or into her farmer's market, everyone knows who she is. Everyone knows she sells quality mushrooms, and she has those customers coming back to her week in, week out. Same with me. I'm trusted in my community. People know my face. People know where it's coming from. People know my business. We're trusted folks. So if we're going to be providing that spiritual, that medical connection, why not come to us first? Because we're already trusted. People know what type of product we produce. They know it's the quality product. And, like Ayesha said, frankly, farming is not, you do it for the love of farming. We're not doing it for the money. So
I love that. And there's a lot to be said there, especially where, even though it's a hard thing to explain to the legislators and the, lawmakers, like there is a spiritual aspect to it that you kind of can't ignore. And so, yeah, no, I'm glad to hear that. Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just gonna say, like, yes, we can't necessarily identify that spiritual aspect in research as it's like done now. But I mean, I think there's also another piece here that's really going to be valuable in terms of having these plants come from a local community where the growers are known, or the farmers, cultivators are known, is that although a lot of the language now is kind of put around the idea that it is a drug, and has a very pharmaceutical terminology, terminology used around it right now. And I feel like, the idea of this is that they work with this, the mushroom, and that they develop a relationship with it, and it helps them, and they don't see it as something that I take this and I'm automatically cured, or I take this and there's nothing else left to do. There's like a relationship and a process kind of being built around it, and it shifts it away from that pharma belief of like, oh, I'm going to take, if it's microdosing, oh, I'm going to take a pill and then this X plus Y equals Z. Right. And so if we can start moving it away from just that mindset in general, and where it starts becoming a community, again, like Joe and I talk a lot about the importance of building community around psychedelics, because that's kind of part of the missing piece, and it brings people together. And we all know the importance in terms of longevity, even around like community and personal connection. So this just all helps to sort of cultivate personal connection when you know who the grower is. And how cool would it be able to be to have, with it being, I know I can imagine this is not something that's going to happen, but where people in the community can come and see what the mushrooms look like. Maybe like when they go to get their dose in the administration session, they can pick out the mushrooms that are kind of, they feel drawn to, but helping to sort of develop that connection with the plant and not seeing it as just another mindless thing to take.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're hitting on really what brought me and probably Steve and most of us to farming is that relationship with the land and with nature, and I really was not a people person before, and then I suddenly seem to be more of a people person now, and and sort of and embracing people in all their in all their suits and t-shirts and everything that it comes in, Joe, I appreciate you bringing up the spiritual part of it, because I think that is really hard, and it's a really hard place for me to talk to about people. And I kind of do hide behind the language of community and connection to make my point, because I feel like when I cross over I can get a little bit stigmatized on my woo-woo-ness.
Well, we're really looking forward to a time when all the buttoned up concern about getting the legislation passed and making sure it's looked upon, in a very conservative medical fashion, when that's old news already, like passe. Just kind of like we saw with cannabis. It's like, oh no, cannabis is just for like medicine and for glaucoma. It's like nobody talks about that anymore, because it is for medicine and glaucoma, but it's really also for the plant medicine, and it's just a personal freedom thing, right? But psychedelics is even like more beyond that, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of where we want to be in the near future, which is talking about spirituality and community, which is what really psychedelics are about. But we're going to lead with our strongest foot, which are accurate veteran, PTSD, like intractable depression, like all these things. That's the best foot to lead with to get the community started, because without that, we're gonna be. It's a harder argument to lead with spirituality.
And to be fair, and to be fair, that is where it's needed first and most. And maybe that's a little bit of a concern with this legislation. But like you said, I'll take it. But I am concerned that it's not going to be accessible to like some of the people who need it the most, because at a couple of thousand per journey, it's not necessarily going to be something I can sort of qualify for, financially. So, I think that's going to, have to be a barrier to consider, and to wonder how to get that mostly, to the people who need it the most. And for sure, I think the longer term it's going to lead to, it's going to lead to a better citizenship and a better community down the road. But you're right. Let's get started.
I think an important piece too, though, is then when we start looking at the barrier of price, is like, how expensive do they make it for you to become a grower? How expensive do they make it for a service center to open, for training, and all of these various things that are needed? Like, the state is really kind of in some like deciding what that pricing is, and if they price people so high to that the end product ends up being inaccessible, then what are we doing this for?
Mm.
One thing that we're really interested in with Psychedelic League is but suggesting to the towns and these municipalities and counties that there's really a hidden benefit in psychedelics, is that it's going to increase wellness, which is going to cut down on costs for behavioral health costs. There's entire reports that are done by these counties about the costs and the impact of behavioral health issues on the productivity of their towns and their workforce and their first responders. So really want to encourage them to increase access. And I think part of the increasing access, especially to first responders and their veteran population, will be scholarships. Like you can subsidize. There's no reason they couldn't subsidize the what the service centers are offering, right? And then you can, then for the population, part of the population who can pay $3,500 for an experience, they can pay, and then that there can be a subsidy and a scholarship. You know, I think they call it scholarship a lot in around psychedelics. So like a psychedelic scholarship would be something that should really be focused on as part of access and equity, you know. And I think the number is going to help a lot. Like we've been talking to people who have the numbers that show how towns can be positively impacted. And I think if they can see it on, just like if we could see the visual we were talking about before, about the quantity of psilocybin and mushrooms, if you could show on a visual of like the amount of savings you can make as a town by helping with wellness, you know, they might be willing to pay some of that back into the community, the psychedelic community. So we will see, you know.
Yeah, I like the idea of that also being able to, like, let's say you have a grower in your town, you have a service center in your town, you have a lab in your town, like, or these things are really close by, or with maybe townships that there are, you know, maybe some sort of reciprocal relationship. Like, how is it that the towns can help support like each part of this process to help make it more accessible, and not doing so at the cost of the person growing it, at the cost of all of these other things, to where, you know, there's scholarship available for different sort of pieces. Maybe it's the worker permit, maybe it's, you know, some of the other licensure. Like, what other opportunity is there for the town to support these businesses that are ultimately going to help their community?
So we really thank you both for jumping on. It was super informative, and I think we kind of almost have some homework if you're willing to work with us to get. I would love to see that visual. I think so many people we've spoken to have had the same thing. They start like running math in their head when they're talking about, you know, numbers, and it's like it'd be cool to just kind of see, even if it's not to scale, as they say, you know, see something on a piece of paper that says this is really what you need, and that helps us work backwards, you know. So yeah, thanks again. Super informative, and you both are adding a lot to the communities by doing what you're doing, you know, and thank you for being the face of responsible farming, you know.
Yeah, and thank you both for asking us. And yeah, I totally support, and I would be happy to work with you guys to make sure, you know, we get the information so that, you know, our leaders can make good decisions, informed decisions, not just fear-based decisions.
Absolutely, yes. Let's get this wonderful mushroom out to those that need it the most. I'm all for it.
Love that.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you guys so much.
Look forward to talking soon.
Bye-bye.